So it starts with small things because you're right. It can feel scary and it can feel overwhelming. Like, what are we doing here? We're going to starting to change that, twist ourselves inside out to how you said it. And it's like, wow, that's overwhelming. So we start with little pieces and those little pieces will compound because the goal here is to build our self-trust. We have to see ourselves differently than how we have been seeing ourselves. Most often it's because the inner critic has been running the narrative. So if we take time each day to reflect on how can I appreciate how I showed up in the last 24 hours, we're starting to change that narrative, starting to change that dialogue.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about overcoming self-sabotage and limiting beliefs. I'm delighted to welcome Kamini Wood. Kamini is a best-selling author, speaker, certified life coach, and the founder and CEO of Live Joy Your Way. You can reach Kamini at her website, kaminiwood.com, where you can download a free strategy guide, 8 steps to overcome your limiting beliefs. And I'll include that link in the show notes. Welcome, Kamini. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
Linda, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited for this conversation. I love to talk about these things. They mean a lot to me. And as I was checking out your website, there was a little tantalizing phrase in there that I think leads to a story. And so I would love to hear more. It said, "When I saw my daughter dim her own light because she didn't believe her shine was good enough, my world stopped and changed forever." And I thought, boy, I'm a mom and I care
Mm-hmm.
so much about my kids. I feel like there's a story behind that. Would you mind sharing? Why do you do what you do?
That story is my catalyst moment. That story, the moment where I could see my own daughter dimming her light in deference to other people and that people pleasing, making sure that they were happy with her, that she was enough. That was my catalyst moment to recognize she learned that from somewhere. And for me, it was slowing down to take a look in the mirror and recognize that my children were going to mirror back how I was showing up in the world. And for me, that was the beginning of diving deep into my own narratives, my own limiting beliefs, the way that I was showing up in this world, doing that hard work in order to figure out how I wanted to shift and show up differently, not just for myself, but for my children. But beyond that, also to break some generational patterns, because as I went through my work, I realized that part of the people pleasing, the high achiever, right? And there's nothing, I want to just be very clear. I'm not saying that being empathetic is an issue. I actually think it's one of my superpowers. When we lean too far into it and it becomes people pleasing and we lose traction or even the connection with self, that's when we start looking and recognizing it's a weakness. But the work that I did wasn't just for me or for them. It was to also break that cycle for the generations after my children. Right. And through the work, I also recognized that that was my calling. I needed to go through that experience. I needed to go through the self growth so that I could then not only train in how to help others, but I could utilize my own personal experience to complement the training, helping other people understand themselves deeper so that they can move themselves forward.
And doesn't that make all the difference? I think the best teachers have that combination of learning and experience where it's a bit of both. So I'm not telling you this because the textbook said so. I'm telling you this because I've lived it. I've not only done the research, I have done the me search. And so I can say, yes, this makes a difference. I love as you shared your story, I was waiting for something about your daughter. And the amazing thing is, as you were speaking, you recognized, wait a minute, she's learned that from somewhere. I need to pause and take a look in the mirror. And I think as parents, that's so important. Our children, they learn this behavior. Our default setting is what we're taught from the people around us. So hopefully that's home. And if it's not, maybe it's daycare or whatever. But we learn how to be a person in our home, in our family, with the people that we're around the most. And a wake up call that can be humbling and it can also be empowering
Yes.
because you can say, you know what? I'm recognizing in you something I don't like about myself. And as I look behind me, I notice I've seen this before. It's a repeating pattern that's going around and around and around. And it will continue to go around and around and around until someone chooses something different.
Exactly.
So I'm so proud of you for being humble enough and aware enough to pay attention and to say, what do I need to do? Rather than, can someone fix my kid?
Oh
It hurts.
gosh, yes. Yes. I love that you just pointed that out because one of the things I talk routinely about too is this concept of mindful or conscious parenting, right? It is about, well, first of all, it's not about fixing our child, it's about understanding our child. And then on top of it, it's recognizing that how we show up, they're picking up information, they're learning from us, whether we overtly say it or how we show up, they're assimilating that interaction or those messages and they're creating stories around it. And so, as parents, it is our responsibility to take ownership of who we are and how we're showing up in order to lead our children. If we think about it, even I equate the work as a parent to that even of leadership. I mean, it's across the board. If we want to lead a team, same thing. Mindfulness and consciousness is so important. How are you showing up as that leader? Because people are, when they're interacting with you, they are assimilating how you're speaking, how they're interacting with you, and they're creating narratives around it.
Isn't that interesting? We teach so much more than the words that come out of our mouth. Darn it. Sometimes we think I said something and that should have made a difference. But when they pay attention to what I'm doing and how I'm living, those messages speak so much louder.
Oh gosh, yes. Yes,
And
absolutely.
okay, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it okay if I just ask another clarifying question that I think is so important? You talked about the difference between being like empathetic and being a people pleaser.
Mm-hmm.
One is quite damaging and the other is quite beneficial. So you
Mm-hmm.
did mention it, but can we just have a little bit more of example so that I can feel like I think many people pleasers feel like I'm trying to make people happy. I'm trying
Mm,
to do a good thing. And I feel walked on all the time. So what's
yes.
wrong? Do I have to
Yes.
be walked on in order to make other people happy? And the answer is no.
No. Yes. So with being empathetic, and why I say that that's my superpower is to me, being an empathetic person means I can listen to somebody and I can put myself in their shoes. I can relate to them. I can feel how they might be feeling. But the line for me, which I've learned, is when you then step into fix it mode or over functioning or let me take ownership of this. So being empathetic says, let me be here with you. People pleasing says, let me take ownership of what it is that you're experiencing. Let me make sure that you're okay. And that's when we find ourselves in that over functioning space where, to your point, we feel walked on. We start to feel resentful. We actually feel burnt out at times. And also, there's a never enough because no matter what we do, we're not getting the thing that we're really craving, which is we want to matter and we want to make sure that the other person somehow witnesses us in a way that we can fill that narrative of I'm enough or I'm good enough or I'm worthy or I'm deserving. Most often that's where the people pleasing comes from.
Right. Because we
Mm-hmm.
want someone else to validate that I am good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't come from out there, it comes from in here. And I think as we get more and more people to wake up to that, we're so much happier.
Yes. Yes. That is honestly my life's work, I should say. And I'm not ashamed to say it is about how can I help more and more people recognize that letting go of those external validations, letting go of even the external motivators, right? So we're so often motivated extrinsically. It's about recognizing that it's all an inside out job. The intrinsic motivation allows us to really be connected to something and to work on something because it matters to us. The internal validation is where it's at because what we need is to be able to recognize and see ourselves as valuable, as worthy. If we're constantly looking for it from outside of ourselves, it's completely outside of our control and we may never get it. Ultimately, though, recognizing that our worthiness already exists in our mere essence, and the work really becomes with recognizing and owning the fact that we can intrinsically create that by just owning our own values, what's important to me, owning our belief system. What do I truly believe? What are those core beliefs? And honestly, it comes from uh honoring our needs. What is it that I need? And then finding ways to communicate it to the people in our life.
Hmm. Isn't that amazing? So I agree 100% with everything you said, but I'm trying to put myself in the perspective of I've never heard this before. And it sounds like you want to take everything that I am and rip it apart and then try to reassemble me as something new. And I'm supposed to come out happier and better at the other end. And it feels a little bit overwhelming. I also
Mm-hmm.
thought as we go back to the thing where you're talking about your daughter, and here you're saying, you know what? My daughter is struggling. I am trying to become the person who will show up and model how to be happy. And this route that feels like take me inside out, undo all my validations. How come I can't just judge myself and my worth by how many likes I have on my social media and my last post? How come I have to come up from an internal thing? It feels a little bit scary. Like,
Mm-hmm.
can I trust myself? And when the answer is instead of a question, am I good enough? Flip it around. I am good enough. That is the baseline.
Yes.
Can we trust that? How do we get people to trust that?
Oh, that is such a powerful question. And what you're really referring to is how do we realign and reconnect with self-trust? And what we're doing by switching that from a question to a statement, I am good enough. What we're also doing is challenging our brain to start one, looking for evidence, because that's how brains work, right? We really, what we're doing is we're activating the reticular activating system to say, oh, I'm good enough. Okay, so now let me scan for evidence to say that that's true. The other way that we build self-trust, though, is to slow down every day. And I challenge each one of my clients, ask yourself at the end of every day, what are 3 to 5 things that I can appreciate about how I showed up today or who I was today? Not what did I do today, but who was I today?
Ooh.
And what that really is it's a gratitude practice, shifted a little bit into let me appreciate myself. But again, not in the human doing part of our being, but our human being part of our being, right? How did I show up today? How can I appreciate who I was? And it can be something as simple as, wow, I really appreciate how patient I was when I was stuck in traffic today. That allows for a little bit of room to recognize that we can trust ourselves to show up in a challenging moment. And within us, we have the ability to exercise some patience. So it starts with small things because you're right, it can feel scary and it can feel overwhelming. Like, what are we doing here? We're going to twist ourselves inside out to how you said it. And it's like, wow, that's overwhelming. So we start with little pieces, and those little pieces will compound because if the goal here is to build our self-trust, we have to see ourselves differently than how we have been seeing ourselves. Most often it's because the inner critic has been running the narrative. So if we take time each day to reflect on how can I appreciate how I showed up in the last 24 hours, we're starting to change that narrative. We're starting to change that dialogue.
Wow. Okay. I love how you put that so beautifully. We are looking for evidence. We have always been looking for evidence, evidence that says I am good enough. And when I'm looking at external sources, my evidence might be how many views did I get? How many likes did I get? I'm using these as evidence to say, am I good enough? And the crazy thing is, it's not a one and done. It's like, am I good enough today? Because even if we had people say, yay, your last selfie, you looked great, it's not going to carry me through until tomorrow. I need
Right?
that. I need that evidence again. And
Yes.
so what we're looking for is a different source for our evidence and being able to trust ourselves as the source of that evidence, not just what we're doing, my
Mhm.
to-do list, but my being, which is a totally new thing. And as we're talking about evidence, which I love, and you mentioned about the reticular activating system, and as we're looking for evidence, we have a tendency to think, because we're logical beings, right? That
Mhm.
the way we come up with conclusions is I looked at the evidence, I made the conclusion. And we
Mhm.
don't realize often that it actually works the other way. We kind of make a conclusion and then we seek for evidence to be able to prove that we're right. It's like the scientific method. You come up with a hypothesis and then you look
Yep.
for supporting evidence. Our brains work the same way. And as
Yes.
you talked about that reticulator activating system, which is a little bundle of nerves at the base
Mhm.
of our brain stem, and what it does is it's a filter. It takes all the input and it narrows it down into with all the things that what parts are going to make it to my conscious mind. And it's a big filter, like from 11 million down to like 40. It's really big.
Yes. Yes.
So it works just like how you said. We start with our hypothesis, I am good enough, or I stink, or whatever. And
Mhm.
then our brain says, okay, 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 that's the hypothesis. Let's look for supporting evidence. And then out of all the things that happen today, if I think, man, I stink, the only things that are going to make it into my conscious mind are the ones that support, wow, I screwed up again today. I
Mhm.
was 5 minutes late picking up my kids from school. I didn't get everything done on my to-do list. I didn't do this. I didn't do this. So by flipping that around and saying, ooh, new hypothesis. I am good enough. Let's train ourselves to look for that evidence. Oh, wow, 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 wow. Oh, you're amazing. Okay. Do you have any comments on that before I ask another question?
No, I think what you said, it summarized it so beautifully. But if people are wondering, would it really work, right? Because they want more, just think of it this way. Our reticular activating system is very similar to if we purchase a car and suddenly everybody on the road seems to have that same car. And we think of ourselves as a trendsetter. When in fact, really, it's just our brain is scanning for that car because it's, to your point, it's been part of our consciousness. We have a choice to switch, to flip that script and to put into our consciousness, I am good enough, or I am enough, or I am worthy, or I am deserving. And we put that into that consciousness. It allows our brain to then, no matter what's happening around us, to scan for that. So to use your example, if the thought is I stink, and then we would notice we were 5 minutes late to pick up our kids. If the thought is I am good enough or I'm a loving parent, I guarantee you the thought wouldn't be, or the notice, what we noticed about the day wasn't I was 5 minutes late. It was, I got my children and they're home safe.
Boy, isn't that a much more positive, reassuring message? Because that's
Mhm.
really all we wanted in the first place.
Mhm. Yes.
Because we do care.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
And I say that I guarantee it because that's the script that I flipped around in my own brain. Again, to your point at the beginning of our conversation, it's not just theory out of a book, it's life experience. And I've done that work. And so being able to speak to that is so important. And I know full well that if I'm not on that, and this is work that we keep doing, it's not a one and done thing. So if I'm having a day where I'm just off, I immediately catch it though now because I'm like, oh, there I go. I only paid attention to being 5 minutes late versus, hey, I just got to see 45 minutes of my son's lacrosse game. I'm able to catch it. But that's why this work is so important because it's continual. It's the ability to keep growing and evolving as individuals.
wow. So we need to keep looking for what we did well,
Wow.
what we
Mhm.
did right, how we showed up. And I love and appreciate that you mentioned you've done the me search.
Mhm.
So when people ask, say, well, whatever, does this really work? So Kamini can say, yes, it does. So how did you feel before? And how did you feel? Do you feel about yourself now?
Such a great question. I will say that before I thought everything was fine, although I will share that my anxiety used to be through the roof and I would self-doubt constantly. But what I taught myself as a high achiever was just muscle through that, just pretend it doesn't exist, which just led to more kind of unease and disrest. Like I always felt kind of on edge. I will say that through the work and learning to do things, the hard things like set boundaries and to speak up about my needs, that was difficult and uncomfortable because here's the thing about setting boundaries that many people don't talk about is people who have been benefiting from your lack of boundaries are going to have a problem with your new boundaries. And I just offer that because that's also learned experience. And you learn to sit in the discomfort and expand out and allow that discomfort to be there. And for the recognition to say, oh, interesting. Maybe that's not a relationship that fully serves me as I once thought it did. You learn to build that muscle. And now on the other side of it, and I will say, like I mentioned before, it's an ever evolving process. So there's still growth to be had, right? I'm not done by any stretch. There are definitely days where I find myself needing to ground center and refocus. I feel so much more confident about who I am. I feel I wouldn't be in the position of helping others if I didn't feel like I had experienced enough in order to be able to help others. And I also will hold with compassion and grace that, yes, I still have anxiety because, part of the work is to recognize it's not trying to undo or change or shame. Instead, it's understand and to say, wow, there's a part of me that does get anxious. And I can love that part of me in concert with the other parts of me. I don't have to get rid of certain parts. Instead, I'm this whole being. And that's really what self-acceptance is about.
Wow. So I don't have to be perfect in order to be enough.
That's right.
Thank heavens for that, because I'm not.
Right. Me neither.
Wow. So that is a thing. So it's interesting as you're sharing kind of your before and during and after, but we're still during, is thinking, actually, I'm doing great. I'm fine. I know that I'm capable. I know that I'm able to do things. In fact, when it gets hard, all I really need to do is just to roll up my sleeves and work harder. Work harder, do more. And yet there's a feeling often of, but I'm really tired. And is there
Mm,
ever going to be a point where it's enough? And then to work through and create boundaries, which means sometimes saying no, which can be really hard for some people, and recognizing what am I willing to do? What scenarios make a win-win rather than a they win at my expense?
right.
And I think that's a really good place to kind of put those boundaries. It's like, I am happy to serve. I am, but I don't
Mhm.
want to be taken advantage of. I don't appreciate that at all. And
Right.
so if there's someone who would like to make me their doormat or their slave, I say, no, thank you. I'm really not interested. So I don't know, carry on after that. But it's not as comfortable as just saying yes, because that makes the other person very, very happy. And when you say no, you don't get that kind of feedback.
Mhm.
And I love that you talked about how your confidence has grown. It's like, I'm okay. I know
Mhm.
that where I am right now, even though it's not perfect, is not only good enough, it's fantastic.
Yes. And taking up space, right? Going into a room and taking up space, not shrinking. Most often when we are doubtful or we have, the narratives of not being good enough or unworthy, we shrink. We tend to avoid conflict, not using our voice, just to your point, saying yes when what we really want to say is no. And that's the difference that I've seen is I'm not by any stretch walking into a room and being some aggressive individual, but I just own my space now where I'm able to be in a room. And if somebody asks something of me that I cannot or I choose not to engage in, I can say no with confidence and allow for them to be, they're going to be upset. They're allowed to have that feeling. I'm not responsible for that feeling. That was a huge shift for me, right? Recognize that I'm not responsible for how they are responding or reacting to my no. Now, of course, if I'm rude or obnoxious, I have some responsibility for the delivery. But if I'm, you know, loving, respectful, and just saying I can't make something work and somebody's upset, I have to let them own it. It's not mine to fix.
That's a beautiful clarification. I appreciate it. And I've been mulling in my mind your concept or the thought that I can take up space. And I thought, that that's something I need to chew on a little bit because I know the feeling from experience, of course, of feeling silent and
Mm-hmm.
invisible. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess another word for invisible is I am not allowed to take up space. But I've never equated those two descriptions as being the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be thinking on that one for a little while. Okay. You also mentioned shame. I would love to talk, if it's a little bit more, about the idea of shame informed coaching or understanding
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
shame affects us.
Oh, yes. Shame is such a interesting thing because it is can be so covert, right? It can be just this little thing that sneaks into the room with us, but shame is the thing that says that there's something wrong with me. And more often than not, I have clients that'll come to me and that is what I hear them say is, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just, I don't know, why can't I just stop this? As soon as I hear that, I make them pause and stop and recognize that that's a covert way of saying, I'm not like at my core, there is something wrong with my being. And really, that right there, when we're shaming ourselves, we have to deal with that. We've got to go through the unshaming process because what happens when we shame ourselves is the ability to shift and change is it's suffocated because if the whole time we're thinking that there's something wrong with us, we don't see the possibility of seeing ourselves in a different way. And oftentimes, shame is very, very old. It is something that we had an experience or we heard something said to us when we were younger, and our little brain, our little person made it mean something different. Sometimes it was covert or overt, and somebody meant to shame us. They actually told us, you're bad, right? That's a shaming statement. But sometimes it's an experience that we've had. Like, for instance, I'm working with an individual right now that was bullied by their peers. Not a great situation, but the shame that came with not being able to fight back or to stand up for himself, that created a story of shame of that there's something wrong with me because I couldn't well, one, there's something wrong with me because they didn't like me. But then you take the shame and saying, I couldn't even stand up for myself. Clearly, I'm not a strong individual. Now you take that into adulthood, especially of the male gender. And now I'm not even a man, right? I'm not a strong enough man. And then you deal with the stories and the narratives that come with that. So shame itself is at the core of what we have to uncover when we're doing that self work is where am I shaming myself? Where am I telling myself that there's something wrong with me at my core? And taking time to witness it and call it out and actually ask one simple question. Is that really true? Right? Because 9 times out of 10, we can immediately answer that question and say, well, no, that's not true at all. Though 10%, we dive deeper and we say, okay, well, if you think it's true, who told you that? Where did you learn that from? And from there, we can recognize that it's someone else's voice or it's a way that we interpreted a situation or a message. And by witnessing it, and when I mean witness it, I mean actually speak it out loud, we we can break down its power. It's sort of like the best metaphor I have for unshaming is it's like a sailboat and we're taking the wind out of its sails by witnessing it, right? We're taking the ability of it to be able to continue to float away by just naming it and calling it out and challenging what's actually true.
So, shame. I love the way that Brene Brown puts it, the difference between shame and guilt. One is that I did something bad versus I am bad. There's something wrong with me. And that is the key. That's what we're looking for, those thoughts, those feelings. And I think it often goes to I am not lovable. I'm not good enough. I am, and it's that I am. It's like you said, it's the core, it's the identity. It's like nothing I can do will ever be good enough because this is what I am. And so as we go back to, we're looking for evidence to support it. If I just say, I go back to the I stink, I can find evidence that says that, which is kind of scary. So the narratives that we create, we find evidence. So when the question is it really true? I mean, hopefully I can come up with no, but I might also come up with 5,000 little bits of evidence that say, well, yeah, it is true. So how do you help people get around that one?
The When we say it's true, that's the point where we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, you believe it's true. Where did that come from?
Mm.
Where did that story originate? Whose voice was it? Where did you hear that first? Because most often we've convinced ourselves something is true. The best way that I can describe this is, if you tell yourself, and my son was talking to me about this the other day, if you tell yourself a story long enough, you start to believe it. And it's the same concept. If we have been told something time and time again, and this happens in toxic relationships, that's why I'm speaking about this specifically. Like, for instance, if somebody has been in a dynamic that has been toxic for many years, they will start to believe the truth about themselves. But once they can step outside of the relationship and recognize that what that person was telling them was a story, it wasn't actually true. Meaning, let's just take, for example, I'm working with a client right now that was in a very toxic relationship. And for many years, she was told that, she was not loving enough, not giving enough. And she started to believe that. And when she stepped out of the relationship and we started questioning and asking, where did that story first come from? She was able to identify, oh, that was my partner who said that. That was his story. And so that's how we start breaking down that, is it really true? We think it's true until we can step outside of it long enough to ask those questions. Where did I hear this? Who told me this first? How did I come to this place of it being true?
Okay, I love that. So now we have a two-step, kind of a knockout punch. Step one, is it true? Let's ask the question. Let's look at it. Let's not just accept that it's true. Let's get curious about it. Let's ask. And then if I recognize immediately, no, that's not true. Look at, I'm awesome. Look at all these wonderful things that I'm doing. But if I'm not to that place and I say, well, yeah, it is true. Step two is, where did it come from? What voice is in your head when that thought, those words come into your mind? Let's find the source. And then we can say, wait a minute, that's not really true. That's what so and so told me over and over and over again. Then we can step back and say, I don't like that narrative. Let's pick a new one.
Yes, exactly. And to that point, a lot of the young adults, teenagers and emerging adults, most often will say, "Oh yeah, it's true." And that's when I really have to push them to get curious with it. Say, "Okay, let's assume it's true. Where did we learn that? Where did it come from?" And a lot of times they will then be able to identify, "Oh, maybe I picked that up from my peers, or maybe I did hear it at home and I've now taken it on as mine." And it's never about blaming or again shaming where it came from, because then we're losing track of the whole purpose here. It's to just understand and create that sense, not just understanding, but now what do I want to do with it? Now that I understand where this came from, what aligned action do I want to take?
Oh, I appreciate so much that you brought up that idea and reminder that it's not about looking for who to blame. It's like, oh man, I feel like garbage. Who can I blame for this feeling like garbage? Because we can find a source and then we can be angry, but that doesn't make us better. It just makes us bitter.
Yes. Yes. And where does that bitterness get us?
It
Mhm.
makes us feel justified, but it doesn't make us any happier.
Right.
So
Right.
my objective is healing. and to be happy. I want to be happy. And being bitter, being angry, blaming doesn't make me happy. So, oh, that's fantastic. I love how you've simplified it so beautifully. Is there anything you want to make sure that we cover before we close today?
I love our conversation and I've loved the context in which we've had it. I think the one other thing that I would just offer is through the process of this, self-compassion is so key, right? This goes in context and in conjunction with shame. As you go through any personal development or growth, there are some hard things that we look at, and learning to be kind to ourselves versus being judgmental is so important, as well as the second pillar of self-compassion, which is common humanity, recognizing that we're not alone in this experience. Other people have had similar experiences. So when you are going through something like this, or you're going through personal development, or you're going through these shifts, finding that support, being able to talk to the people that, do love on you and do support you, it's such an important part of the process.
I love that. Basics come down to having self-compassion and recognizing that we're not alone, and reaching out for people who will support us rather than to pull us down, because we're not alone.
Right. Yes. Yes. And it's so important to remember that.
Oh, Kame, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I've loved this. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you for having me. I've really appreciated the conversation.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Raman Sharma, who said, "Our biggest enemy is our own self-doubt. We really can achieve extraordinary things in our lives, but we sabotage our greatness because of fear." Today, I invite our listeners to allow ourselves to be extraordinary and to do great things. See you next time on Linda's Corner. Thanks for listening. Please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. And if you'd like to heal your life from the inside out, there is a free video series at hopeforhealingfoundation.org. Just click on the free stuff tab. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, and You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.